Hi everyone, the Partial Prophet here. Thanks for tuning in. So I wanted to remind you that we know in part and we prophesy in part, and when Jesus comes, we will see fully. Okay, so this is the December prophecy update. He is acting like Gog. Okay, and the person who's acting like Gog is Trump. So we'll talk about that. So first I did a summary of so I wanted to show you really how we are really in the last days, that um, the prophecies that needed to be fulfilled have been fulfilled. Um, and it's just been a really busy time um, in the world. And mostly, so I'm thinking especially with Trump's first term, Biden's term, and then now Trump's second term, that um, they have done a lot of stuff to um, like really get God mad, really seriously, like a lot of stuff against Israel. And so I wanted to get those all charted out um, so that we can keep that in mind. So in Trump's first term, it started with the deal of the century. And that was when we really saw like God's kind of judgment. Like, I mean, so the deal of the century, what was interesting about that was that, I mean, it wasn't even accepted by the Palestinians, but we still suffered consequences in the United States because of it. And so, um, that was like, so 7 weeks after the deal of the century was the start of the coronavirus shutdown. And then we had rioting. The BLM rioters were 119 and 120 days after the deal of the century. And then we had like a fiery furnace type phase in the month of August. So definitely very interesting. Definitely really prophetical. And then Trump went on and did, so there was these 6, they called it the Abraham Accords. So actually there was 5 of them. And then, but he had peace deal signings on September 15th. So what was interesting about that was, so from August 13th, the start of the first peace deal, quote unquote, with UAE, to February 8th was 180 days. And then we saw on February 9th was the start of Trump's impeachment. Okay, so the 180 days, we get that out of Esther 1, that there was a 180-day banquet. Okay, but the other significance of the 180 number is that, so you see that number 18 in there, which is 666. So you want to keep an eye out for 18 numbers connected to Trump. Okay, so I wrote 6 peace deals, quote unquote, and then 7 events. Okay, so that was Trump's first term. And then with Biden, so I actually, on this chart with Trump, I did a better job of kind of charting some of the consequences that we suffered. Like, things have just been kind of crazy, and I really didn't get much of a chance to do it during Biden's term, but I got a few of them charted out. So one of the things on February 18th, so this is pretty early on in Biden's term, he restarted nuclear talks with Iran, and he was dropping the sanctions on them. And because remember, Trump dropped out of the JCPOA. And so right before Biden did that, there was this winter storm Uri on February 13th through the 17th in 2021. And so we saw like a week of power outages in Texas due to a freak winter storm. and I actually made a video at that time. I mean, it was really apocalyptic looking. This the strange things that were going on in Texas during that time. And then Biden went on to he signed a paper with Lapid that, like mentioned two-state solution, and he, his administration put together this maritime agreement, which was giving away Israel's sea land. And then he was trying to do, so Trump had these 6 peace deals, and then Biden was trying to get together this Saudi deal. And so that was announced in the paper on August 9th. Well, on August 8th, we saw the really bad Maui fire. August 20th was Hurricane Hillary. August 30th was Hurricane Idalia. And then on 9/11 in 2023, Biden had this Iran deal. So I wrote like $6 billion. So I think, that was giving money to Iran, or releasing, I think it was releasing $6 billion of their money. Okay. But right, so I mean, back to the Saudi deal. So 60 days after that was when Hamas invaded Israel. Okay. On Simchat Torah. So that's definitely a picture of, while they're saying peace and safety. So this is so I'd actually charted it out. So here's the verse that talks about peace and safety. 1 Thessalonians 5:1-4, and then Jeremiah 6 says, "They have healed the brokenness of my people superficially, saying peace, peace, but there is no peace." And so I kind of made a chart of how Netanyahu and Biden were kind of running around talking about this Saudi peace deal. And then, like in the month of September, and then we saw sudden destruction on 10/7. So, and I wrote flight on a Sabbath because that definitely happened on a Sabbath. And then, so then during the war, okay, so then, so 10/7 started the war in Israel. And then, and then while the war was going on, Biden kept trying to push these ceasefires and pauses and just crazy stuff. Like, I wanted him to just leave Israel alone so they could fight this war, but he didn't. And so on 11/9 in 2023 was they pushed this idea of 4-hour pauses during the war. I mean, just kind of a dumb way to fight a war. But it's interesting how this 9/11 or 11/9 numbers show up a lot connected to Biden, but they also show up a lot connected to Trump too. And then, so then Biden had his first ceasefire in 11/2023, which on the Hebrew date, it started on Kislev 11, which is 9/11 on the Hebrew calendar, which, by the way, is Biden's Hebrew birthday, so that's definitely very interesting. So, and Biden was trying to cut off the weapons to Israel, and on 9/24/24, he was at the UN and he mentioned two-state in his speech. And it's like that same day Tropical Storm Helene was forming, and then on 10/24 it hit, and there was 96 people got killed in that hurricane. And then Biden didn't want Israel to attack Iran's nuclear sites, and that was on Rosh Hashanah Eve. So it's interesting too when you see, like, it's like Israel's enemies when they're doing things on Jewish holidays that are against Israel. And then, so, because then on 10/4 and 10/9 in 2024, in a phone call, Biden was telling Israel not to strike Iran's oil facilities. And then we saw on 10/7, Hurricane Milton exploded into a Cat 5 in the Gulf. On 10/9 in 2024, Milton hit Florida, and that was a Cat 3, and it killed at least 17. So then we saw the second ceasefire that Biden pushed on Israel was actually with Hezbollah. That was on 11/27, which actually I didn't realize that, but there's a hidden 9/11. If you take 27, that adds up to 9, and so 11/9/2024. So a hidden 9/11 there. That happens a lot with prophetic things. Okay, and then the third ceasefire was January 15th of 2025, and that was, back to Israel and Hamas. Trump was involved in that one. Okay, and it actually started on 1/19, which is another hidden 9/11 number. So anyways, and so we saw, like, right before that, on January 7th, was when the terrible Los Angeles fires happened. And then I guess I wrote nonstop weather events and airport events. And so I really think Biden was fulfilling the prophecy of the restrainer. Because it says, and you know what restrains him now? So then in his time he will be revealed. So one of the things is he was also restraining Trump. Okay, like, so during, so Trump was president in his first term, but then Biden really came and restrained him during, and they were actually going after him, just trying to get him indicted on anything they could come up with. I mean, it was just in the news all the time. So he was definitely the restrainer of Trump, but Biden was also a huge restrainer of Israel trying to fight this war. Okay. Okay, so this is 2 Thessalonians 2:6-9. It says, and you know what restrains him now, so that in his time he will be revealed. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work, only he who now restrains will do so until he is taken out of the way. So I highlighted the number 7, okay, because that connects to Biden being the 7th king, okay. Then we move on to verse 8. And so a lot of people think those numbers, the numbering of the verses, aren't inspired, but man, they really match up to prophecy, okay. So, because then in verse 8 it says, then that lawless one will be revealed, whom the Lord will slay with the breath of his mouth and bring to an end by the appearance of his coming. So that number 8 connects to the 8th king, which is Trump. Trump was the 6th king that becomes the 8th king. And then it says, that is the one whose coming is in accord with the activity of Satan, with all power and signs and false wonders. Okay. So that's definitely connected to Trump. Okay. But the restrainer, Biden the restrainer, trying to restrain Trump and definitely trying to restrain Israel. And so anyways, and the title I put on these slides are like Peace with God ? Because they're running around saying, oh, we're accomplishing peace, but what's happening? All these plagues and hurricanes and tornadoes and stuff are happening in America because of their actions. There's a verse in the Bible where it says, the fathers have eaten sour grapes and the kids' teeth are put on edge. And, but there comes a time in the Messianic era, then the Bible says they will no longer say the fathers eat sour grapes and the kids' teeth are set on edge. So that's cool. So then, so I counted, for Biden, that was like 3 ceasefires. And, I mean, so we read a lot in the Bible about like 3 days and then 3 more days. And then there's the number like 1335. And, so I was wondering if like, so we saw Biden with his 3 ceasefires, and then when Trump does his 3 ceasefires, then I'm wondering if, okay, then, we're at the end. We're in the, at the end of the days, everything's been fulfilled. And I didn't know, I mean, Trump was involved in Biden's 3rd ceasefire. So I didn't know to count that or not, but I think Trump's done enough of his own, so we don't need to. So anyways, but the ceasefire really was happening during Trump's term. I mean, it started on January 19th. Trump's inauguration was on the 20th. So we saw on February 10th that's, Trump talked about, all hell was going to break loose if Hamas didn't release the hostages. So he he did accomplish getting 3 hostages released on February 15th. One of them was American. But we saw on 3/18 the peace talks breaking down. Okay. On February 4th, February 4th, we saw Trump mentioning his Gaza plan, wanting to rebuild or build in Gaza. At this, and he was with Netanyahu at the White House because they were trying to negotiate the 2nd phase of the January 15th plan. But like I said, it broke down on 3/18. But then on 4/7, Trump and Netanyahu had another meeting at the White House. Because I think Netanyahu showed up because he really wanted to talk to Trump about, attacking Iran's nuclear facilities. But that's when Trump kind of threw in another wrench in the system, and he said he initiated direct talks with Iran. Okay, so but we saw on that same day there was 90 tornadoes in the heartland. Okay, and rain and floods. Okay, so God says don't mess with Israel. And then on April 12th was when they had their first meeting with Iran, which ended up happening on Passover Eve. On April 16th, there was a New York Times report on Trump squashing Israel's plans to strike Iran in May. Okay, and that happened in the middle of Passover, day 4 of Passover. Iran canceled the talks on 5/3. I think that might have had to do with like Israel. I don't know if it was because of Israel planning to strike strike Iran, or yeah, I don't remember the circumstances why they canceled the talks. But there was something going on. Sorry that I don't remember. And then we saw. Okay, so that was that. Okay, so that brings us to May 13th, 14th, and 15th when Trump was in the Middle East. On May 13th, we saw flooding in Maryland. On 5/15 was tornadoes. 5/23 was the 5th round of Iran talks, and I think that ended up being the last one. And then on 6/17, we found out that the U.S. wasn't planning to tell Israel where Khamenei is. I mean, seriously, if America would stop bothering Israel, they can, actually might be able to deal with their enemies and get rid of some of them. Oh yeah, so that would be interesting around 6/17 to see what kind of weather events happen then. On 6/23 and 24, that was when Trump announced a ceasefire between Israel and Iran. Like, he first announced it on the 23rd, but then both sides kind of broke the ceasefire, and then he announced it again on the 24th. What's interesting about 6/24 is that that's the anniversary of them overturning Roe versus Wade. Now, they overturned Roe versus Wade in 2022. So if you take 6/24/2022, you get 666. Okay, so that's one of the 666s for Trump. 6/24/2025 is actually 669. So, I mean, you could say like the nine's an upside down. Six, So, anyways, okay, so then on 7/18, they made a Syrian and Israel ceasefire. It was mediated by the U.S., it was supported by Turkey and Jordan, and that was following the bloodshed in the Druze area that killed over 300. So the Syrians were going after, like, the people don't like the Druze. Anyway, so that, and Israel wants, Israel actually has been trying to defend the Druze people. So I think that's why this ceasefire was forced on them. But recently Israel's been like doing some attacks in Syria because, to continue to try to stop the bloodshed and killing of the Druze. And I think there's one other people group too that they're protecting in Syria. So, and then on 9/23, Trump met with leaders of 8 Arab countries. That's when he was talking about his 21-point plan, which, the 21-point plan actually included the idea for a 2-state solution. I don't know if that's the 1 point that got taken out or if it's actually still in the 20-point plan. On 9/25, Trump won't allow Israel to annex the West Bank. So this is kind of different than his first term, where he recognized, let's see, what's the name of the area? He recognized some area as belonging to Israel back in his first term. So this is, kind of different. Okay. And so we saw on 9/26 was Hurricane Humberto, and then there was flash floods in Arizona. Okay, so then on 9/29 was Trump and Netanyahu announcing the 20-point peace plan, which someone called the deal of the millennium, so I have kind of clung to that title because it's nice and short, and kind of matches the deal of the century. But what was interesting on 9/29, which by the way, another hidden 9/11, 9, and then the 2 plus 9 add up to 11. Okay. First Trump made Netanyahu apologize to Qatar for they did a Doha strike in Qatar to try to kill some Hamas leadership on 9/9. And Trump, and Qatar obviously was really mad about that, and so Trump made Netanyahu apologize. Just crazy behavior. And so we saw just 3 days later after they announced this peace plan, the U.S. shutdown started on October 1st. And then, so the ceasefire actually started on October 10th. The hostages were freed on October 13th, and then Trump went to Egypt and signed some peace papers with Egypt on that day. I think he was in Israel first, and then he went to Egypt. And then on 11/6, we saw Kazakhstan joins the Abrahamic Accords. So is that the sixth Abrahamic Accord? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. What's interesting is when they talk about it, like they only talk about like 4 in 2020, and so I don't know why that is. Like maybe a couple of the countries weren't really considered Israel's enemies, and so it's not a big deal that they signed a peace deal with Israel. I mean, so that's a possibility. Not quite sure what the thinking is behind that. And then we saw on 11/10, 18, and 21 of this year, Trump had meetings with questionable people. So then we can see, if we're counting the ceasefire between Israel and Iran, and then the Syrian and Israel ceasefire, that makes 2, and then if we count the DOM, that makes 3. So Trump has, kind of 3 of his own peace plans. And then I'm not quite sure where to put in the Kazakhstan joining the Abrahamic Accords. Where do I fit that in? Do I make it 6 of the first term? Not totally sure. So that's just a list of all of them. Okay, and so I talked about nobles seeking Trump out. That comes from Daniel 4:36, fulfilled prophecy. Because like Trump had kind of lost some power during the American shutdown. But then, it says, "And my majesty and splendor were restored to me, and then nobles began seeking me out." So like I said before, on November 10th, he met with the president of Syria, quote unquote president. I put that in quotes. And then on November 18th, he met with the Saudi crown prince. On November 21st, he met with the new mayor of New York, Mandami. So just meeting with questionable people that are enemies of Israel. Especially the president of Syria. Like, okay, they washed him up and put a suit on him. But he is probably still a terrorist at heart. And then I talked about too in my last video about like the picture of Babylon, and so a lot of the prophets on YouTube are missing it, but to me it's just so clear, because if you see this picture of Trump with the Saudi prince, they're sitting on golden colored chairs, and there you could see the gold trim that Trump has put, you know, all over the White House. And then the Saudi prince too was talking about like the billions of dollars, I think it might have been $6 billion, that they were wanting to invest in American companies. So definitely Babylon, big time. And then like this picture on the right too, you can see like the golden plates at the bank. So they had this big fancy banquet too with the Saudi crown prince. So definitely, you know, fulfilling Bible prophecy. On December 7th of this month, we saw Marjorie Taylor Greene did a 60-minute interview. So it's really interesting because she was kind of this really strong Trump supporter, and then now she is not, you know, and so it's always kind of helpful to listen to an insider who sees things that maybe the rest of us don't see, and she's really concerned about a lot of Trump's behavior. And I guess, you know, the big thing, obviously, the big falling apart between Trump and Marjorie Taylor Greene was the Jeffrey Epstein files. And, you know, so they had that, you know, kind of big clash with that. On 11/21, she said she was going to resign in January, you know, basically because of the pressure from Trump, or the, you know, because Trump really turned on her. So I said this is another example of 666. You know, so she's not able to buy or sell because she's no longer supporting Trump exactly the way he wants to be supported. And then I wrote, because it's Christmas time, I was kind of thinking, oh, like this 666 thing is kind of matches Santa's naughty or nice list. You know, you're either on Trump's naughty list or you're on his nice list. And Marjorie Taylor Greene switched lists. Because people don't realize that the verses about the 666 are actually being fulfilled. They're looking for, I mean, because someone somewhere thought it was going to be an actual chip put inside you instead of a metaphorical mark. And really a mark kind of that God sees. So, because God's people get their mark too, and it's not a literal mark, it's a spiritual mark. So Revelation 13:16 says, and he causes all, the small and the great, the rich and the poor, and the freemen and the slaves, to be given a mark on their right hand or on their forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark, that is, the name of the beast or the number of its name. So I put in the ESV translation for verse 17 because I thought it did a better job. Sometimes translators put their own thoughts into verses. And, you know, so then that's not good, because then we're getting away from what God actually said. So that's December 7th. In my last video, I was really expecting something to happen on 12/1, because we saw Netanyahu fulfill the Daniel 12/1 on 12/1/2022. because it says, "At that time, Michael, the great prince who stands over the sons of your people, will arise, and there will be a time of distress such as never occurred since there was a nation until that time." Definitely has been distress in Israel ever since Netanyahu returned to power. And then I highlighted the last part of this verse in green. It says, "And at that time your people, everyone who is found written in the book, will be rescued," because I definitely think that connects to the Messiah. Okay. So, but I think I kind of missed it. I think it's just maybe saying that Jesus is going to return in the 12th month, is what I'm thinking now. Because I probably needed to keep reading the rest of the chapter. So, but also that thing where it says, "At that time your people, everyone who's found written in the book, will be rescued." God says in Revelation 12:14 that the two wings of the great eagle were given to the woman so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place where she was nourished for a time, times, and half a time from the presence of the serpent. So, God is rescuing us from some of this distress that's happening because of Netanyahu returning. I think, and from Trump returning. And so, and the time, times, and half a time, like I finally figured that out. And so the time would be Obama. The times is Trump's term, 4-year term, and then Biden's 4-year term. And then the half a time would connect to Trump's term that he's in right now. And so half a time partly connects to that he's not going to fulfill a whole term, I don't believe. But it really has to do with it's sometimes translated as the dividing of time. And so really his term right now is about really putting that last division in the United States that's going to cause the Civil War. And so then we read in Daniel 12:11, it says, "From the time that the regular sacrifice is abolished and the abomination of desolation is set up, there will be 1290 days. How blessed is he who keeps waiting and attains to the 1335 days." And so I've been looking at that 1335 number a lot and I think it could connect to Hanukkah. Okay. Because we have the first day of Hanukkah, then there's 6 days, the 3 days connect to 6 days of Hanukkah. And then you add that to the 1 and that gets 7 days. But then like the 8th day connects to the number 5, because I think the division maybe really happens on the 8th day. And so that's Monday, December 22nd, and so we'll see what happens. I'm doing this the night before. Like, is Trump gonna say something that's gonna really put the nail in the coffin to cause this division? So, but the 1335 could also connect to, like I said, the 1 could connect to Obama, and then Biden does 3 things. Oh, we'll see. But then the problem with the number 5, well, I don't know. And then Trump does 3 things, and then that leads us to the number 5, the division in America, because, God bringing judgment. So, but then God tells Daniel, "As for you, go your way to the end. Then you will enter into rest and rise again for your allotted portion at the end of the age." So, so we could, the 1335 could be a hidden Hanukkah reference in these verses. Daniel 12:12. So, and then so actually what really happened on 12:1, was kind of the time frame of the controversy with Pete Hegseth and the bombing of the boat in Venezuela, which that was a 9/11 sign too, okay? Because first they killed 9 people, then they killed 2 more, so a total of 11 killed. It happened on 9/2, which could kind of be a hidden 9/11 sign too, because you take the 9 and add it to the 2 and get 11. Which, and then 2025 is a 9, so anyways, so connected to these bombings of these boats in Venezuela, I pulled out the verse of Revelation 13:11 and 13, which connects to the beast from the earth, which is, I definitely think, is Trump. Then I saw another beast coming up out of the earth, and he had 2 horns like a lamb. The 2 horns could connect to Trump and Netanyahu. And he spoke as a dragon, or the 2 horns could connect to his 2 terms. He performs great signs so that he even makes fire come down out of heaven to the earth in the presence of men. So he's been bombing these boats in Venezuela from airplanes, okay, coming down out of fire out of heaven. And remember that the false prophet is going to have false signs, to mislead the people on earth, to deceive. So be careful of that. Also on 12/1 was the start of meteorological winter. And we've been seeing winter storms since before Thanksgiving, which was kind of interesting because they kind of interfered with people trying to travel for Thanksgiving. But what's interesting is, like, these next couple of days before Christmas, I think there's kind of a warming happening, at least in the middle of the country, right before Christmas. And my theory is that that's kind of clearing the way for the rioting that's going to happen. So this is a picture from Back to the Future. We see the giant burning 9/11. I had pointed out before that the 9's kind of looks like a heavenly number because it's hanging up on the building, and then the 11's like an earthly number because it's down on the ground. And so the 9 could connect to the Messiah. Like, the Messiah could be the 9th king. And then the 11 could, 11 could connect to the 2 towers. And it could connect to, like, Biden on the left and then Trump on the right, kind of that picture of right and left. What's interesting is that it kind of looks like the letter H, okay? And so I was wondering if that connects to Hanukkah, because I'm actually wondering if the 9/11 connects to, so Hanukkah has 8 days, but then you could take the days after Hanukkah and take the 9th day of Hanukkah, the 10th day of Hanukkah, and the 11th day of Hanukkah, which actually brings us to Christmas Day. So I'm wondering if those are possible fulfillments of the 9/11 prophecies. Like, I just see 9/11 everywhere. Every time I look at the clock, it's like, oh, it's 9/11. So then we moved into Hanukkah in December. So December 14th was Hanukkah Eve, and then it goes through 12/22, which is the 8th day. Okay, so Hanukkah began 12/14 Eve, okay, in the evening. What's interesting is that the rabbis point out how the year of 2025 is unique in that we are, we have are going to have 2 Hanukkahs in 2025. So, I mean, basically, because what they're saying is the one in 2024 bled over into 2025. So the last 2 days of that Hanukkah were January 1st and January 7th, January 1st and January 2nd, 2025. I had pointed out that kind of made a division of the 8 days into 6 plus 2. Okay. Where 6 is, like Trump's first number, and then, now he's the 8th king. So that's interesting. So a lot of signs connected to Hanukkah. What was interesting is that Charlie Kirk's birthday was 10/14/1983, and December could be considered the 10th month, or it used to be the 10th month, because when you look at the name of it, like December, that deck or whatever connects to 10. So Charlie Kirk, and what's interesting about Charlie Kirk is that his last name connects to church. He was shot in the middle of a Hanukkah menorah, and that information I got from Steve Fletcher. Did a video called The True 924 Kislev 24 Hanukkah, December 13th to 22nd. He's got the starting date for Hanukkah wrong. It's actually December 14th. But he made this video on 9/22/25. So that's all interesting. What's interesting too about Hanukkah is that it's 11 weeks after this deal of the millennium. So the first day of it, or actually the 14th, is 11 weeks, and then it's also 9 weeks after 10/10 and 10/13. Where I talked about this before. 10/10 is when the ceasefire started. 10/13 is when the hostages were released, and then Hanukkah is also 47 weeks after this Biden ceasefire that started on January 19th. Okay, and the 47 number connects to Trump being the 47th king, or sorry, I'm mixing my metaphors. The 47th president. And so one of the things, there's kind of this debate about Hanukkah with, like the early fathers of Judaism, of whether Hanukkah is a picture of increasing light or decreasing light. Okay, so what I actually think is that, I think we have like a Trump Hanukkah that's decreasing light, and then we have a second Hanukkah that's increasing light when the Messiah returns. And because we see that concept of like the second feast, when it doesn't work to do the first feast, like we saw it with the second Passover, that they were unclean because of a dead body, so God gave them the law to have a second Passover. Okay. So I think it's possible we could see a second Passover when Jesus returns. I mean, sorry, the second Hanukkah. So we saw with this Hanukkah, the weekend before the start of Hanukkah was very dark. On Saturday, Brown University had a shooting. American servicemen were attacked in Syria, and then on Sunday, the Hanukkah Eve, was when they had that terrorist attack in Australia at the Hanukkah celebration. And I think that actually happened earlier this year too at another Jewish holiday. There was some attack like at the beginning. I didn't get a chance to look at my notes to figure out when that was. And then what's interesting, so Hanukkah is actually celebrated by Jesus in the Gospels. Okay, so in John 10, it says, at that time, the feast of dedication took place at Jerusalem. That's another name for Hanukkah, the feast of the dedication. It was winter, and Jesus was walking in the temple in the portico of Solomon. I and the Father are one. Okay, so I skipped a bunch of verses and went down to verse 30. I and the Father are one. Verse 31, the Jews picked up stones again to stone him. Jesus answered them, I showed you many good works from the Father. For which of them are you stoning me? The Jews answered him, for a good work we do not stone him, but for blasphemy, and because you, being a man, make yourself out to be God. Okay, so what's really interesting about these verses is, one, they start on John 10:22. Okay, and so we already talked about December. Also could be like considered the 10th month, or used to be the 10th month. And so December 22nd is the 8th day of Hanukkah this year. Okay, and so John 10:22 would connect to December 22. So that doesn't happen every year. Okay, so that makes this Hanukkah unique. Also, it was interesting that Jesus was walking in the temple of the portico. That actually can mean like a covered porch of the temple. Like, they had a porch area that was covered. Okay. Because I think that could connect to the Kennedy Center. So we'll talk about that coming up. And then it's interesting that, so in these verses, we have the Jewish people, wanting to stone Jesus because they saw him making himself out to be God. Okay. And, so I definitely see a connection there in those verses to Trump, like wanting to put his name on the Kennedy Center. So that's that slide. Okay. And then, so Hanukkah Eve, like, this was fascinating to me. That so many of the numbers in prophecy, like, show up connected to December 14th. Okay. Because December 14th is 11 months after January 15th. Okay. So, and remember that the 11 number connects to judgment. Okay. And then December 14th is 47 weeks, 1 day, or 330 days from January 19th. It's 85 days from Charlie Kirk's funeral. It's 84 days from Rosh Hashanah Eve, or the start of fall. We see that 84 number in the book of Luke, where there's a prophetess in the temple, and she is 84 years old. It's 83 days from Trump at the 80th UN General Assembly. It's 80 days from Netanyahu at the 80th UN General Assembly. And so we got those numbers 83 and 80. Those connect to the ages of Moses and Aaron. Okay, when they met before Pharaoh. Okay, so that's definitely interesting. It's 81 days from Trump not allowing the West Bank annex. It's 77 days or 11 weeks from 929, the deal of the millennium. So 77, definitely very interesting. 11 weeks, definitely very interesting. 66 days from 10:10. Okay, we see that 66 number in Leviticus 12. The woman being unclean after giving birth to a daughter. It's 63 days and 9 weeks from October 13th. Okay, and then 12:14 is 8 weeks from 10:20. Okay, 10:20 was when Trump so remember that 10:10 was when the ceasefire started, 10:13 was when the hostages were released. 10:20 is when Trump tore down the east wing of the White House. Okay, so 8 weeks after that. And then Hanukkah Eve is 33 days after 11/12. And 11/12 was like the last day of the shutdown, or they voted the shutdown to end on that date. So 33 also, that number also comes from Leviticus 12. So very interesting there. So I've been wondering about, okay, so like the 3 days of darkness, I've been thinking for a really long time that they connect to the rioting or the civil war that I've been expecting to happen in America, as judgment on America, as God's way of like clearing out the evil people. And so I found this verse in Joel that kind of could show that the darkness connects to the rioting. Okay, because Joel 2 says, "Blow a trumpet in Zion, sound an alarm on my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming, surely it is near, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and thick darkness. As the dawn is spread over the mountains, so there is a great and mighty people. There has never been anything like it, nor will there be again after it's the years of many generations. A fire consumes before them, and behind them a flame burns. The land is like the Garden of Eden before them, but a desolate wilderness behind them, and nothing at all escapes them. They rush on the city, they run on the wall, they climb into the houses, they enter through the windows like a thief. Blow a trumpet in Zion, consecrate a fast, proclaim a solemn assembly. Gather the people, sanctify the congregation, assemble the elders, gather the children and the nursing infants. Let the bridegroom come out of his room, and the bride out of her bridal chamber." So we see darkness listed at least twice, and then, like I said, a great and mighty people. I highlighted that. And so it talks about these people, they enter through the windows like a thief. Okay, so we hear Jesus talk about his coming as like a thief in the night. Okay. And these people entering through the windows. Okay, so remember that I said Jesus is the door and Trump is the window. Okay, because we read about, like, if you try to enter God's kingdom any other way than the door, like trying to get through the window, you're a false shepherd. Okay. And so that connects to that. And then then I highlighted too, let the bridegroom come out of his room. So that could be talking about like Jesus returning. Okay. And the bride out of her chamber, like, that would be like the woman in the wilderness being protected. Anyways, and so I was wondering about, so originally I was thinking like 3 days of darkness might be 12/22, like starting on the 8th day of Hanukkah, and 12/23 or 12/24, but I was actually thinking So then I actually was thinking that, because, like I talked about the 9th day of Hanukkah, the 10th day of Hanukkah, the 11th day of Hanukkah, so 12/23, 12/24, and 12/25 would be days 9, 10, and 11 from the start of Hanukkah. And Jesus says, like, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll raise it up again, or whatever, and then Jesus rises on the third day. And so that's why I'm actually now leaning toward 12, 23, 24, and 25, but maybe something starts the evening of the 22nd. So I was looking at the 22nd because the 8th day of Hanukkah, because it talks about like circumcision being on the 22nd. And then like the 8th day of holidays are like solemn occasions. I think the October 7th, the war in Israel was on an 8th day. So definitely very solemn there. So we just gotta wait and see what happens. And I talked about this in my last video too. I don't know if the 3 days, well, I just talked about where Jesus said, destroy this temple, and then in 3 days I'll raise it up again. But sometimes I wonder if the 3 days of darkness start when Jesus comes back. Like, because it talks about Israel has light in their houses while this darkness is going on in Egypt. So that was a thought too. But except that I think, maybe like, the 3 days of darkness is like dark, dark, dark. And then, it talks about Jesus when he comes, he's, oh, I wish I could remember the verse, the Christmas verse about, just a light shines in the darkness, So, and then the Hanukkah signs connecting to Trump. So I'm wondering if this Hanukkah that we've just been in is like Trump's Hanukkah, the decreasing light. Because what we saw right before it started on 12/10, the U.S. seized a Venezuela oil tanker. Because what's interesting is Hanukkah is kind of like all about the oil, the story of the oil. Okay. But the U.S. actually seized tankers on 12/10, 12/20, and 12/21. Okay, so, right before Hanukkah and then during Hanukkah. Okay, 3 tankers. And then during the holiday of Hanukkah, the Jewish people give gelt, like to their children. Okay, and so gelt's like, it's money. Okay. They do have those like chocolate coins. I don't know if like there was actually money that was called gelt, before it became these chocolate coins that we see now. And so that would connect to Trump being the merchant, So, and the 8 days connects to the 8th king. Okay, the other thing too is during Hanukkah, the Jewish people spin dreidels. Okay, and Trump is king of the spins. He's always lying and telling these stories and spinning, uh, you know, the truth about reality into some whatever conspiracy theory. So Trump is king of the spins. And then, and the whole game of dreidel too is like put some money in the pot, take some money out. Depending on how you spin. Which also could be a 666 picture of like, okay, if you're nice to Trump, you can stay, in the pot or whatever, or if you are not nice, you get taken out of the pot or whatever. So, and the other thing too is when the Jewish people are lighting the menorah candles, there's this whole thing where like they put the candles in from left to right and then they light them from right to left or vice versa. Um, and so there's that left to right and right to left picture, which, like connects to the Civil War, the left versus right in America. Um, so, and so on December 10th, so we saw that the U.S. seized the Venezuela oil tanker, okay? So what I believe is that we saw the fulfillment of Trump being Gog on December 10th, okay? Because in Ezekiel 38, which by the way, Ezekiel 38 adds up to 11, 3 plus 8, okay? So God says, Son of man, set your face toward Gog of the land of Magog, the prince of Rosh, Meshach, and Tubal, and prophesy against him. And then God's talking about Gog and says, You will go up, you will come like a storm, you will be like a cloud covering the land, you and all your troops, and many peoples with you. Thus says the Lord God. And I highlighted 10 because Trump sees this tanker on December 10th. Thus says the Lord God, it will come about on that day that thoughts will come into your mind, and you will devise an evil plan. And you will say, I will go up against the land of unwalled villages. I will go against those who are at rest, that live securely, all of them living without walls and having no bars or gates, to capture spoil and to seize plunder, to turn your hand against the waste places which are now inhabited, and against the people who are gathered from the nations, who have acquired cattle and goods, who live at the center of the world. And so that actually, so a lot of people think that's Israel, but it could be Venezuela. Okay. I mean, there could be two fulfillments too. So, and I mean, I actually think the first fulfillment of these verses was Putin and Ukraine. I mean, because he wanted to seize plunder, he wanted to get land. Okay. But the verses go on to say, verse 13, Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish with all its villages will say to you, Have you come to capture spoil? Have you assembled your company to seize plunder, to carry away silver and gold, to take away cattle and goods, to capture great spoil? So I highlighted merchants, because Trump and his people definitely connect to the merchants, and so a lot of people think that this whole thing, like is about the oil, and not necessarily just stealing some oil, but trying to like put a stop to the Venezuela oil trade because maybe it's interfering with some of Trump's businesses or his son's businesses or something along those lines. So definitely coming to capture spoil. Okay. And so people think that these verses in Ezekiel are about the war of Gog and Magog. But I think they're not parsing out the prophecy correctly, because we don't necessarily have to start a war in Venezuela. Although, I mean, Trump's definitely leaning that way, like, definitely sending military assets out there. But the verses go on to say, because the thing is what I think is the verses go on to talk about the civil war that's going to happen. Because it says, it shall come about in the last days that I'll bring you against my land, so that the nations may know me when I am sanctified through you before their eyes, O Gog. like, I mean, so we've already seen Trump kind of going against Israel, okay? So I think the verses could be talking about multiple events, okay? Everyone kind of smushes them all into just the heading of the war. Because then verse 18 says, "It will come about on that day when God comes against the land of Israel, declares the Lord God, that my fury will mount up in my anger." And then God says, "I will cough," and so the verse 18, I should have highlighted that verse 18 there. So then God says, "I will call for a sword against him on all my mountains, declares the Lord. Every man's sword will be against his brother." I should have highlighted that last line because that's a picture of the Civil War. Okay. And so really what's the war of Gog and Magog is really the Civil War, which is judgment for Trump and the stuff that he did against Israel. Okay. But we know who Gog is. We know Trump is Gog because he's the merchant coming to capture spoil and seize plunder and carry away silver and gold. And there could also be kind of a shadow of, kind of his, Trump's plan with Gaza too, because he wants to build there, you know, um, definitely a economic um, plan for Gaza, a way to make money. So I talked about this in earlier videos that, I mean, Trump definitely fulfilled 2 Thessalonians 2:4. Okay, first I highlighted, "Let no one in any way deceive you," 2 Thessalonians 2:3. Because he says, "The man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God." So that connects to those other verses, where they were wanting to stone Jesus for making himself out to be like God. Definitely a connection to these verses. Okay. But it was interesting that these verses are 2:4, 2 Thessalonians 2:4, because we saw Trump made his Gaza announcement on 2:4. Also connected to that is, Trump's planning to head the board of peace for Gaza. So I wrote 9/29. I guess that's when he announced it, when they were talking about the deal of the millennium, because it's connected. The board of peace is connected to the deal of the millennium. So that's that. And then so then I think another way that Trump's been taking his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God, is Trump putting his name on the John F. Kennedy Memorial Center. So here's a picture on the right, new signage, the Donald J. Trump in the John F. Kennedy Memorial Center for the Performing Arts is unveiled on the Kennedy Center Friday, December 19, 2025 in Washington. Okay, so the fact that this was going to happen actually was announced on December 18th. Okay, so I highlighted that 18 number. That's connects to 666. Okay. And actually, December 18th was 60 days after 10/20, after Trump destroyed the White House. Okay. The west wing of the White House. Or east wing. Maybe it's the east wing. Ugh, sorry, I'm getting confused. But anyways, when they were announcing, let me think. At some point when Trump was talking about the Kennedy Center, he talked about a new golden age of the arts in America. Okay, so definitely putting up that golden calf, okay, or the golden statue. 1219, I mean, they did not waste any time, but 1219, they already went and put the sign up there, okay. What's interesting about 1219 is that's Kislev 29, which is 929 on the Hebrew calendar, which connects to the same date for the deal of the millennium, which was 929 on the Gregorian calendar. So definitely interesting. And then what's interesting too is that it's 18 letters. If you add up, Trump added the Donald J. Trump and, at the beginning of, where it said the John F. Kennedy Memorial Center. And so that's 18 letters. Okay, so remember 18 connects to 666. So, I mean, we're not counting the period. That would make it 19. So the period's not a letter, it's punctuation. Anyways, but that would make it 19 whatever. But I think the key thing that we need to look at is the 18. So another 18 connected to Trump. Okay, so we got 3 big ones besides all the like smaller hidden ones. But the biggest one was when he announced that he was moving the embassy to Jerusalem. That was 12/6 of 2017. So 12/6 is 666. And that happened on Kislev 18, which, that 18 number is 666. And then like I said, the overturning Roe v. Wade was a 666 date, and then now we got these 18 letters on the Kennedy Center. Okay, so so we have to have a little bit of imagination of, there's no actual temple on the earth right now, okay, but America and Israel are types of temples, okay, because that's where they're the 2 nations in the world where God's people live. And then, America used to be a really strong nation sending out missionaries, so the word of God was definitely coming from America around the world, okay. I mean, until, we kind of fell. And so what we got to see when Trump is really desecrating important buildings in America, it's similar to like previous dictators and stuff that did desecrations in the actual temple at the time, like Antiochus. I mean, so this is interesting too, that this is happening. So this is actually on the 4th and the 5th days of Hanukkah, in the middle of Hanukkah. Okay. So so I definitely think he's, acting like he's God. So my sister pointed out too that this is a memorial center. Like someone else had made the point of like, it was almost like Trump putting his name on someone's like gravestone. Just really bizarre behavior. So, and then the other thing that happened on 12/19 was when they actually reported on the Project Sunrise being pitched by the United States. So let me read this to you. The U.S., so this was on 12/19, U.S. pitches Project Sunrise plan to turn Gaza into high-tech metropolis. The blueprint drafted by Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff could have the U.S. commit to roughly 20% of some reconstruction cost over 10 years. And then Project Sunrise, the subtitle says Building a New and Unified Gaza. Okay. And the article starts by saying, beachside luxury resorts, high-speed rail, AI optimized smart grids, and then it goes on from there. And so it talks about committing some of America's money. Like, I don't really understand the purpose of this. Like, you know, like who would be owning Gaza? Who would be profiting from, these high rises? And I mean, who would be living in these high rises? Or who would be living in, who would be profiting from the luxury resorts? What happens to the Palestinians? We had already saw with Gaza, like all that money that got pumped into Gaza went to building tunnels. Okay. So does anyone have any faith that, this Project Sunrise could actually, excuse me, actually, be accomplished with Hamas still being around? I mean, I guess the plan is to unarm Hamas. Like, that's gonna ever happen. Anyways, but it's interesting too when they use terms like, so Project Sunrise, like, Jesus is kind of connected to the sun and the sunrise, so it's interesting when Trump uses messianic terms for his projects. So that might be another way too, where he's displaying himself as being God or being the Lord Messiah. And then look at this article. JFK's niece, Carrie Kennedy, vows to remove Trump's name from the Kennedy Center with a pickaxe. Okay. Not right away, but like 3.5 years when Donald's done being president is kind of her plan. But it shows like people are reacting really strongly to this. Okay. Not too keen on it. So let's see. And then also too, kind of similar to that, so this was actually like a couple years ago or last year, someone introduced a bill to rename Washington Dulles Airport after Trump. And the reason why this stands out to me is that the other airport in the DC area is the Reagan Airport. And so if they actually rename the Dulles Airport to Trump, you have a Trump airport and a Reagan airport, and that would connect to like Daniel's statue, the 8 kings, where Reagan is like the first king and Trump is the 8th king. So I thought that was interesting. So this picture, I don't have the picture of the statue anymore, but you could go in my previous videos and see a picture of the statue. But this is Trump with this 9/11 hat. It says 45 to 47, but you add those together, you get 9/11. And so what's interesting is that he's keeping the dash because he thinks he was, that's the delusion. And the false image that he puts up of Biden is that Biden stole the 46th presidency from him. But it's interesting that it's, you got this 9 to 11 because that could connect to these 3 days, of Hanukkah, the 9th day, the 10th day to the 11th day. Okay. And then too, I thought it was interesting that he's the 8th king because something made me think about an octopus the other day, and I'm like, man, that is so Trump with his arms like everywhere. He's planning stuff in Gaza. He's taking over the Kennedy Center. I mean, he's starting a war down in Venezuela. It's like, man, this guy's busy, and Ishmael, who I definitely think is Trump's fulfilling the prophecies of Ishmael. It talks about Ishmael's every hand, something like that, every hand against another or something like that. whatever it says, Trump is definitely fulfilling that. So then it says, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains, but pray that it may not happen in the winter. For those days will be time of tribulation, such as not occurred since the beginning of the creation, which God created until now and never will. Unless the Lord had shortened those days, no life would have been saved, but for the sake of the elect whom he chose, he shortened the days. Now, one of the things about, so we read in Daniel that the 1290th day is setting up the abomination of desolation, and so that happened on December 12th last year when Trump was named Times Person of the Year. But as definitely a second fulfillment of these, so shortening the days would be like shortening the time of Trump's, second term. But I definitely could see maybe these fulfilling the like the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, could be these people coming out to start the civil war. Okay. Or I don't know, and or Trump doing something, doing something even more standing in the temple type thing on the 22nd. So, and those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. So that would be the people connected to Jesus, the Jewish Messiah. Flee to the mountains, like look to the mountains. Where does your help come from? Look to God for your help. And then, so then it's interesting. It says, pray that it may not happen in the winter. So 1221 is the start of winter. Okay. So this could be, so the rioting could actually be the Great Tribulation. I believe we've been in tribulation since like 2010, like 15 years of tribulation, getting us ready for the return of Jesus. But there's still kind of a short little great tribulation, which we won't be a part of, like people that believe God and follow Jesus. God's gonna save us from the days of wrath. Anyways, so Daniel 9:27. So what I'm wondering is, like, it says he will confirm a covenant with many for 1 week, but in the middle of that week he will bring sacrifices and offerings to a halt. I think this verse has been highly translated wrong, and I couldn't even find a translation that I think is translating it more accurately. Because I think what it's saying is there's a covenant with many for 1 week, and then for half a week, which doesn't necessarily have to be in the middle of that week. It's, just another 3 more days, which that could connect to Genesis 40, where Joseph said, there was 3 days and there's 3 more days. And so it says, for those 3 days, he will bring sacrifices and offerings to a halt. So I'm wondering if the 1 week connects to Hanukkah, and then the half a week is, like the 3 days of darkness after Hanukkah. Because then it says, on the wing of abominations will come one who destroys, until the decreed end is poured out on the one who destroys. So on the wing of Trump's abominations will come these rioters, so that's why maybe we're going to see even something more sacrilegious of Trump that really sparks this civil war. Anyways, too, and I thought it was interesting too. Oh, here I wrote it down. The wing could connect to the east wing of the White House. So we already saw Trump committing an abomination by tearing down the east wing of the White House. And then on the wing of that abomination will come these rioters. Okay. Other people like wanting to destroy America. Because there's the 10 horns plus the beast. They hate the harlot, and want to burn her up with fire. Okay, and so this chart's not really working out, but I'll have to work on it like after everything happened, because like I said, with the deal of the century, 7 weeks later we saw the COVID shutdown. 120 days later were the George Floyd riots. 190 days later was the explosion in Lebanon, and so with the deal of the millennium, like the shutdown happened like 3 days later, and then I was thinking maybe like 60 days later we were going to see riots in America, because 10/7 was 60 days after the Saudi deal. And also it says Babylon judgment is 1 hour, which would connect to that 60 number, but I think we passed the 60 number mark. And so every time I come up with the idea, then it falls apart. So I'm not really sure how many days later. The other thing too on this chart, and I don't know how many days later I think we're gonna be seeing a fiery furnace in Israel. But what was interesting too was today on the news too, they talked about how there's a strain of flu that's really rising. Okay, I mean, because with the deal of the century we had COVID, really kind of plaguing everybody, but maybe now it's the flu plague. And so I could add that to my chart. Like assuming that God acts pretty similarly and brings similar judgments. So we'll just have to wait and see what happens. Like probably when it's all done, then we could chart it out and then we'll go, oh yeah, look at the patterns. But I'm not quite figuring it out right now. Okay, so peace and safety. People running around saying, while they're saying peace and safety, then destruction will come upon them suddenly. So we have Trump and Netanyahu running around talking about the Gaza 20-point plan. And then now Trump and his peeps are running around trying to push, get this 28-point plan for Ukraine. I mean, which they're trying to get Ukraine to give up land, for this peace plan. Even though we know from history that trading land for peace never works. But they even said today too that so Russia, I don't think you could make. Russia and Hamas are so similar that there's no way you could make a peace deal with them. They might like feign interest, but that would be faking. They're faking it. But we saw on November 17th that the UN voted to back Trump's peace plan for Gaza. And then 4 weeks later was 12/14 Hanukkah Eve after November 17th. January 4th would be 7 weeks. So I don't know if that's an important time frame, the 7 weeks from November 17th to January 4th. But I definitely couldn't really figure out what would be in the middle that would be an end to sacrifice and grain offering. All my 7-week time frames kind of fell apart because we went on too long. I had thought maybe the shutdown or the stop to the shutdown was the stop to sacrifice and grain offering, but then we just kept going, and so the 7 weeks, I don't know, it didn't quite work out, so we'll have to see what happens. But like I said, maybe the week is Hanukkah, and then the 3 days is 3 days of darkness after Hanukkah, or the half a week. And then, so 1 Thessalonians 5:3 while they're saying peace and safety, so that could connect to the eighth king, the 5+3. I mean, definitely we see Trump running around peace and safety and trying to get his people to, make these peace deals. Trump is the one who's like saying, oh, I, put an end to 7 wars or 6 wars or whatever he said. But we did also see the Pope in the Middle East from 1127 to 12:2 also running around saying peace there. And then I thought it was interesting too because we also see Christians are also saying peace on earth during Christmas season. So that's interesting. So anyways, and so I thought it was interesting that they're trying to push this 28-point plan for Ukraine while Trump is like preparing for a war with Venezuela. It just seems a little nutty. But in Matthew 24, we read that we will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. So definitely Trump talking about his plans for Venezuela would be like rumors of wars. So with the boats in Venezuela, there was 29 boats bombed, killing at least 104. And he's got a buildup of U.S. military planes and warships near Venezuela. The other thing that's happening too that sounds like rumors of war is the U.S. has been retaliating in Syria because I don't know if I mentioned this already. Oh yeah, because on the 13th was when 3 Americans got killed in Syria, got attacked in Syria. So now the U.S. is retaliating from that. So definitely a rumor of war. Don't know where these things are gonna go. But I definitely think Trump bombing these boats, I really think it's a bad thing. It's not the way to deal with the drug problem, and because he could be killing innocent people, we don't know their stories. And also, oh, what was I going to say about that? It completely slipped my mind. Anyways, so on this page, I'm in kind of keeping this list of, what could be a possible setup for the Civil War. We read in the scriptures about how a house divided against itself will not stand. So is it Trump's DEI policies? Is it Trump putting National Guard in various cities? Trump's immigration policies? Trump's CDC cutting vaccines? What's interesting on the 18th, let me think. Yeah, was when Congress, December 18th, Congress, leaves for vacation without extending subsidies for healthcare. Which, what's interesting about that is in the middle of the week, of Hanukkah. So are people going to get mad that they don't have their health insurance subsidies? There's the whole Jeffrey Epstein debacle. I told you about the fight with Marjorie Taylor Greene, the seditious video of the 6 Democrats and the drama around that. And then war in Venezuela, or the war in Syria, the bombing of boats in Venezuela. And then now we got Trump putting his name on the Kennedy Center, tearing down the West Wing. Wait. Did I say West Wing over here? Oh, where is that? Okay, there I said East Wing. I think it's the East Wing, so I gotta fix that slide. Sorry about that. So a little bit of can't even think of what's that called. Okay, so anyways, and then it talks about when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation is near. Because then it says Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Definitely a picture of the Civil War. And so Jerusalem surrounded by armies could be the National Guard and ICE in America. But like I said, it could also be the left versus right, the Civil War. In Israel right now, they're talking about setting up this international stabilization force, or they're going to call it the ISF, in Gaza as part of Trump's ceasefire, to kind of like, make sure this ceasefire happens or whatever to keep the peace, because it's worked so well all the other places around Israel, like in Lebanon. So, anyways, so I also made list of, I wanted to show you how we're fulfilling all the time frames in Daniel 9. The 70 years was when Trump moved the embassy. The 70 weeks, we saw 70 weeks after the deal of the century, that 70 weeks, 2 days later, Netanyahu was out, so kind of the end of Trump and Netanyahu at that time. Biden had a Saudi deal, and 70 weeks later was when Trump was named Times Person of the Year. Biden's hostage deal on 11/20/21 was 70 weeks, 6 days after he signed the paper with Lapid. 70 weeks after the maritime agreement, Nikki Haley dropped out, making Trump the probable candidate. 70 weeks after JCPOA was 11/14/2016, which was when Obama had a speech about the White House standing ready to assist the Trump administration transition. So that's, like Obama's 70 week of, that's when we saw him out of, losing his power. 7 weeks, we saw could connect to the 7 years. The 7 years to the day after Obama's JCPOA was Biden signing the paper with Lapid. The exact date. 7 weeks after the DOC was the start of the COVID shutdown. 62 weeks, we saw that Biden's electoral college vote was 62 days after 11/7, and that ended up being on January 7th. It would have been January 6th if there wasn't the rioting, and then put a stop to it. So that was interesting. Netanyahu was out on 6/2/21, so that's got a hint in 62. 62 weeks, 4 days of war was Trump's electoral college vote on 12/17/24. So that was interesting. I'm assuming that's Israel's war. And then Revelation 11:2 and 13:5 talks about like 42 months, and so that'd be 42 months of Biden. 7/21/24 is 42 months, 2 days after Biden's inauguration, which 7/21 was when Biden had COVID. Okay, so but yeah, so we had the debate, and then Trump was almost shot, and then Biden had COVID, and then we saw Biden ultimately dropping out. Okay. All kind of in that same, around that same time frame, 7/21. Revelation 12:6 connects to, okay, talks about 1260 days of the two witnesses, I guess. And so that connects to Trump and Netanyahu. So 12:6 was the embassy announcement. What was interesting was this year was, okay, so I got 1260 days being like 8/21/2017 to 2/1/2021. What was interesting is this year we saw the Kilauea erupting. Like the lava was erupting 1,000 feet into the air. on 12/6/2025. So that's 8 years after Trump's embassy announcement. Revelation 12:14 talks about the times, and half the time, and I already talked about that. Because we see for half a time, so we see then there would be a fourth kingdom as strong as iron, in that you saw the feet until it's partly of potter's clay and partly of iron. It will be a divided kingdom. So that's why times time and half a time, the half a time could connect to the division, the divided kingdom. And then for 2300 evenings, I connect that to Obama's presidency. It's approximately 6.38 years. The 23 number actually connects to Obama's numbers are like 13 and then 23. So interesting that it, says 2300 days. And then I'm talking about the 1290 days in Daniel 12. July 18, 2016 to January 28, 2020, the deal of the century inclusive is 1290 days. So the deal of the century was a abomination that caused desolation. I mean, we saw that with COVID. July 18, 2016 was the start of the Republican National Convention, where Trump and Pence were declared the nominees. Okay, so that's 1290 days, and I think I have on this chart is like 4 of the 1290 days. So like I said, the DOC was 1290 days after the RNC. Biden's Saudi deal was 1290 days after the deal of the century, which, by the way, happened to be on Obama's birthday. But isn't that interesting? That's how you know you're fulfilling prophecy, because, this stuff's just so weird. It just wouldn't normally happen. And then I already talked about 1290 landing on 12/12/24. Also, July 18, 2024 was 1290 days after January 6th. Okay, so that's interesting too. Trump spoke on the last day of the RNC on July 18th. Oh, you got that 18 number there too in 2024. So that's interesting. And then we see another weeks, maybe I already talked about this, week 70, day 2 is 12/12/12. So that's another thing that shows up on 12/12/2024. It's week 70, day 2 from the Saudi deal. Okay. So definitely interesting. Probably don't have anything new to say about this. This is just a slide about Trump being named Times Person of the Year again. Okay, so another thing that happened this month, December 4th, was when they had the closed meeting where they showed the second video of the Venezuela boat bombing from 9/2. What was interesting about this meeting is that the Republicans and the Democrats came out with two very different reactions. Okay. So a lot of the Republicans that support Trump were like, I didn't see anything wrong. And then the Democrats came out and they're like, this is very wrong. Okay. So I think this is a picture of the deluding influence, because it says, for this reason, God will send upon them a deluding influence so that they will believe what is false. This totally reminds me of the scene in the Left Behind movie where Kirk Cameron's character saw the Antichrist shoot the men, but everyone else saw a different scenario that, didn't make the Antichrist look bad. So, that was what the author kind of wrote into the books to show the deluding influence that would come up. So kind of interesting that I think we kind of saw a type of fulfillment of that. So, December 7th, which, by the way, was the 84th year after Pearl Harbor, we see that 84 time frame. The widow in the temple was 84 years old when Jesus went to get circumcised. So on December 7th, ABC showed the Santa Claus at 8 p.m. What's interesting is Tim Allen's name is 8 letters. Scott Calvin is 11 letters. So 8 letters would connect to Trump being the 8th king. 11 letters would connect to like 47, adds up to 11. We saw Doc in Back to the Future was always running around going, "Great Scott." The Santa Claus was released 11/11/1994, which would be like 11 plus 11 equals 22, which would connect to the 8th king, that number 22. So the Santa Claus movies too, they're all about, okay, so the first movie especially is like a businessman becomes the new Santa by putting on his coat. Okay, definitely a shadow of like Trump, like acting like the Messiah, by trying to do messianic type things. In the second movie, we had a plastic toy Santa trying to steal Santa's job. He's running around going, "Boo, I am Santa Claus." It definitely sounds like Trump. And then in the third movie, Jack Frost steals Santa's job. The closing credit song was "I'm the Real Santa." So that's kind of the big question of who's the real Santa. And so in our day and age, the real question is who's the real Messiah. Okay. And then another thing that connects to the riots in America is Rachel about to give birth and suffering severe labor pains. So I think when America's about to birth the Messiah, we're going to have very severe labor pains. I mean, we already have had really bad labor pains. But that's why I'm wondering if the riots are kind of like the last plague, the plague on the firstborn in Egypt. So I already talked about this. So Rachel died and was buried on the way to Bethlehem, basically. So definitely a picture of Christmas. And then Jesus on the cross, there were 2 thieves crucified with him, one on the right hand and one on the left. So that picture of the right and the left. The nativity scene is that kind of same picture of the right and the left, and Jesus in the middle. Okay, with Mary and Joseph. And then we saw so many end time signs in December. A third supermoon, a solar flare, like I said, the volcano go erupting, like 12/8 and beyond is all the floods in Washington State. So kind of the days of Noah. On 12/9 was the Northern Lights. Today too, on 12/21 was also some more Northern Lights. On 12/13 was the Geminid meteor shower. On 12/19 was Comet 31's closest approach. On 12/21 was the Ursid's meteor shower. So I'm wondering if Comet 31, it talks about in the last days we're going to see a sign of the Son of Man. Okay, so it says, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of the sky with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the 4 winds, from one end of the sky to the other. So is this comet the sign of the Son of Man? Because remember Jesus's, first birth 2,000 years ago, there was a comet that the wise men followed, to meet him. Okay, so is this the current comet? Is this the comet of, this birthing of Jesus? Okay, so Jesus is coming back. Synchronize your watches. But what's interesting is, just this past week, TikTok is back in the news again because they're actually probably getting ready to complete the sale of it. And and so I thought TikTok was definitely a good sign of like, TikTok, you're almost out of time. Um, so, and then, we see the two trees, the Twin Pines Mall and Back to the Future movie. Um, um, let's see. And then, but we also see like 1335 where so the mall switches to the Lone Pine Mall. Okay. And then, we see the one kind of a hidden 1335 where Marty is the five. What's interesting too is I watched this scene again. So the Lone Pine could connect to Christmas. I watched the scene again too, and we see Marty going from like first he's hanging out on the right hand side, and then he goes to the left hand side of the sign to roll down the hill to get to Doc. Um, so we see kind of that right, moving from right to left. Um, oh, while the clock is changing to 1:34, by the way. Um, so, um, okay, I left these in here in case I wanted to talk about them, but I'll probably skip it. So I had a lot of verses that connect to the rioting in America. It was in my 11:8 video. I definitely think, okay, so Ishmael, okay, so Trump is Ishmael, a wild donkey with his hand against everyone. So like I said, the octopus hands against everyone and whatever, everywhere. Um, but God told Abraham that, within 1 year time frame, he will have his, Abraham will have a son, Isaac, who's the promised son, not Ishmael. Okay. And so I was thinking maybe the 12/12 date of last year, like we're looking to, like, so now we're already past kind of that 1 year date, so we could expect the Messiah any day. I hope we don't have to wait till like January 20th, to wait for the Messiah. Um, so, um, so let's see. Huh. I didn't even really think about that too. That the beginning of this month, 12/1, is 9/11 on the Hebrew calendar. Um, and that was when meteorological winter began. So we're definitely in the time frame of 9/11. And December 23rd, by the way, too, is 11 months, 9 days from the January 15th ceasefire announcement. And it and the Hebrew day too on December 23rd is Tevet 3, which is 1 year after the 119th Congress got started. Which is so interesting too that that's got a 9/11 number, the 119th Congress. So that's definitely interesting. So I think we could be out of time. I already talked about that. So pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on a Sabbath. It said unless those days have been cut short. So I was thinking like cutting short the time of Trump's term, but also cutting short the rioting, but also cutting short the vaccine craziness, or we will all die. Because people not willing to take vaccines for these scary, dangerous diseases. And then also too, it's dangerous in Israel because of all the terrorists that they released in this quote unquote deal of the millennium. So, anyways, so those who mourn the destruction of Jerusalem will merit seeing it rebuilt with the coming of Moshiach. So we hear a voice in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping Rachel is weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted for her children because they are no more. And so this is one of those verses where I think, okay, there's 2 or 3 days of rioting before Jesus shows up because Rachel is weeping for her children. And then don't turn aside to the right and left. Stay in the middle with Jesus. Stay on the dry land with Messiah. Stand by and see the salvation of the Lord. Because the great city, America, is going to be split into 3 parts. Like, we definitely see, God, what he likes to do is separate the light from the darkness. So we're definitely going to see that happen. All right. So definitely a busy month. Okay. So hopefully you're seeing that we have been fulfilling prophecy like left and right for, definitely during Trump's first term and Biden's term too. So hopefully you're seeing that. So that's what I got for you today. So hang in there. If you do see rioting, I did do a video about the 3 days of darkness. I'm gonna try to post a note on it to show you where to start, because I talk a lot about kind of the prophetical dates I was looking at the time, and you could skip all that to the actual verses, because the verses are meant to encourage you during the 3 days of darkness. So because God's going to take care of us. So I thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate you listening. So I pray for God's grace for you to wait and attain till the end of the 1335 days. Until the coming of Messiah. So hang in there. I think he's very near, right at the door. Because I did want to point out that Matthew 25 is where we read about the 5 virgins. And I don't know if I said this, but they tell the 5 foolish virgins to go buy oil. Okay, and then with Trump, stealing these or confiscating, or whatever you want to call it, the Venezuela ships. Venezuela is like, go buy the oil, pay for the oil, stop stealing our oil. So definitely could be a fulfillment of Matthew 25. And then to me, what I think is significant too is the 25 connects to 2025. Okay, and also connects to Christmas. Okay, and so I guess I'll be surprised if we don't see Jesus showing up in this last couple weeks of 2025. So just wanted to say that. Anyway, so like I said, thanks so much for listening. God bless. We'll catch you later.